Yeah, so first off, again, thanks so much for coming to this to my TorCHI talk today. My name is Geordie Graham, and currently I'm a user researcher at Simply Financial. And as Paul mentioned before, I am a huge fan of research operations. So today I'm going to go through a few topics in research operations, and then we're going to have a kind of Q&A. Also, I'm going to have a few polls in it, as I would love to hear your feedback, and I have a few questions for you as we go along. So this talk is going to kind of build your research ops and skills by covering a range of topics with kind of top 3 specific topics that I see as particularly major in research operations today. These are research tool selections, user research repos, along with the topic of democratizing research. Kind of in this discussion, I'm also going to be talking about some of my experiences basically within the field of research ops, as well as some of my experiences within business that has actually affected my perspective on doing research operations. So to kick it off, I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding research operations and really what it entails. So the kind of what is research ops? Kind of at a fundamental level, research operations goal is to impact the value of user research. It's really focused on the management of people, processes, and tools. And it is interesting because when you do look at discussions, people think it is a brand new field. And it really has existed in some form, you know, as researchers, as folks doing user research. The craft of doing effective user research has always been a topic. It's just as research has really grown, there has now become the opportunity to have an explicit role within some teams, and then actually enough kind of information about specific processes that you can actually see a distinct field emerging, much in the same way that we've seen within the design world with design ops and, you know, DevOps within the development world. And so I think, you know, one of the things when we look at research ops is that, you know, everyone who's conducting research is impacted by research ops. So although there are certain organizations that do have dedicated user research ops specialists, there even is a value of actually discussing research ops from a team of one. As you know, research ops affects all functions associated with actually conducting, evaluating, and using user research. So, you know, what I've seen is that there's been a cycle. You know, as there is more need for user research, there has been a greater need for research operations. It alleviates the strain of managing research teams, processes, and insights. And especially as we've seen the rise of, you know, very, very large research teams, you know, more and more tools. This is something that as the future, you know, as we've developed, there's been a greater need and focus on trying to actually develop effective processes to actually improve people's ability to conduct research ops to get that more effective research. I think Nielsen Norman has a really, really effective kind of diagram that, you know, really encapsulates not only the core components of research ops, but also kind of illustrating that idea that they are all connected. So from, you know, working with participants, so thinking like recruiting and screening and managing people, managing incentives, to governance. So, you know, NDAs, privacy, information storage, to knowledge management, you know, collecting and sharing research insights through repositories, tooling, you know, what tools are, you know, most effective at actually getting those insights, looking at competency. So, you know, folks that are enabling and educating onboarding with user research and user researchers, as well as looking at advocacy. So socializing strategies to try and get research ops, to get user research adopted within organizations. So now that I've kind of set the stage for the discussion around, you know, the different components of research ops, I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, my background and, you know, why this topic is something that I'm so passionate about. So I started my career, I did my master's in inclusive design at OCAD. And I, you know, as a result of one of my projects for my kind of final master's research project, I had to go and do participant recruitment. And so, going through the process of doing recruitment, and also actually supporting projects within OCAD, I actually got the attention of an ed tech company while I was doing my master's. And they were like, you know what, we have a user research position. We'd love to hire you. So effectively, went through the process, got the job, and then found out they really, really wanted to do user research. But they really didn't actually have a researcher. They had a designer that did some user research, but had no department, no established tooling, no established processes. And so my role was actually not only to bring research into their organization, but effectively build out the department and all the organizational capabilities to actually conduct regular participant research, and then have that insight funneled into product development. So that was effectively like my first full-time job in research was around ResearchOps effectively, and being able to build those systems. So I didn't realize until later I had many peers that, started within established teams, and, they started with conducting research, whereas I was, going through, assessing vendors and, having to work with lawyers to draft NDAs. And because this is an ed tech company, I was actually working with kids. So looking at parental consent as kind of my initial experience with doing user research. And so that's something that kind of became familiar and comfortable as I moved on from research into different roles. I started also working and developing my own startup, which, because of that experience, I began to look at, okay, how can we implement user research practices within our startups from day one? How do you wind up creating a mature research-focused organization from the ground up, rather than having to actually integrate this practice after the company has been established? And so as a result of that, I had to learn, in both, in my startups and actually in my first job, in engaging organizations. How to actually get people engaged and passionate and bought into the research process, and also to participate in research. I really learned that very personally in my first job, because, I remember this one time I got actually really sick. And we had a situation where research needed to be done. People needed access to, information on participants, where to find them. I was sick unexpectedly, and I was getting, calls at home being like, Geordie, where do we find this? Geordie, what do we do here? And I'm like, I'm sick. I just want to be able to be sick. I want to rest. And they're like, no, we need you. And one of the things that I saw with that was, okay, is there a benefit and value in actually training competency up? If I want to take vacation, I want to be able to have flexibility to take vacation and not have everyone completely dependent on me all the time. And so that really influenced me in terms of looking at how to engage the organization, not only to be advocates and believe in the value of research, but also how do we actually get them to participate in the research process. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about kind of like our first major topic, which is around selecting the right research tools. The state of user research tools has kind of become wild. You can see on the page here, user re-interviews every year does this like user research tools map. And initially, it started out with like, oh, it's like this really cute subway analogy with like the different types of tools that were available and, the different specialties of those tools. I was actually looking at the one for the most recent one, and it was like, looking here, it's like, it's kind of becoming incomprehensible. There's just so many different tools, so many different varieties of tools that you have. You have much more like, specialization, like you can have recruiting for people with disabilities. You can have information in terms of, things that are very distinct and specific in terms of if you want to do, unmoderated sessions in very particular instances with people, that, before it used to be, this is, you're going to use user testing. Now there's so many different kind of types and flavors and subtypes of tools. And, I think one of the things that I've seen is the decision fatigue. When it comes up to, getting contacted, I'm sure many of you are, by vendors being like, I have a specific tool that specializes this and specializes in this, and you're kind of bombarded with information and choices. And even as a tool geek, I've actually found it getting harder and harder to keep up with the tools that are available. And I think that this is something that's going to continue, and it's actually going to accelerate in the recent term. So based on kind of that startup background, as someone who went through Y Combinator and got training on business development, one of the things I do look at is valuation. And so, and I saw that Dovetail, which is user research repository, getting a valuation over $700 million, I see that as, VCs are beginning to, see the value in these sorts of tools. And as a result, more and more people are going to be interested and compelled to actually, try and actually go into the space, because, it is a B2B SaaS environment. B2B SaaS companies, providing software as service to businesses is seen and is actually a lot easier to do than the business to consumer service. And so I see this, map getting more and more populated as more and more companies enter the space, as they see as fertile ground for actually building a business. And from there, actually, this is interesting, but this image is actually taken from the actual tools map image to just show the various types of user research tools that are now available. You've got, active research, as they call it, with like, multiple survey options, specialized tests, video interviewing, usability testing, multiple types of insight management, going through everything from note-taking to transcription to research repositories. I mentioned earlier with Dovetail, like they have 3 different products now that they're actually offering people with different kind of components of the insight management process that people can actually have. Things like participant incentives, scheduling, you've got platform providers like User Interviews helping you with like building internal, participant management systems while also selling you participant recruiting. And it's a lot, and I think one of the key things is, just looking at the various options, there's a lot of options, but there's limited time for, making decisions. And also too, we don't have giant budgets. So being able to like look at some steps and strategies that can help you pick the right tools for what you need. But before we get to that, I'm actually going to be at one of our first polls. So I'm going to actually ask you, just as an example, about, a question about remote testing platforms. So, just to start things off, opportunity for kind of discussion. Which remote testing platforms have you used in the past 2 years? So I'm going to send this off as a poll, and I'm going to launch it, and I'd love to hear people's feedback. Okay, looks like everyone has answered. I'm gonna get one more second. I said that, and then someone answered. So I think we've got everyone. So we're gonna end the poll. And I'm gonna share the results with everyone. And yeah, so my first question is to folks in, and the actual call here, what has been your experience with remote research tools that you're currently using?
Are you thinking in the sense of, has it been good, positive or negative, or?
Yeah, has it been neutral in the sense of, has it been positive for folks? Have you found that you've had kind of negative experiences with some of the remote research tools that you're using?
Well, for myself, it's been pretty awesome compared to before having such tools.
That's great to hear. Thanks so much, Paul. I guess any other experiences? Okay, well, we will actually move on to, as we talked about before, you know, that piece around with so many different types of tools, what kind of considerations you can have for tools. I kind of actually apply the jobs to be done framework with tools. You know, initially when I'm planning on figuring out what sort of tools that I have, for example, my current job was simply financial. I came in, there was no budget, no established tools. And so, you know, I looked at it as I need to have kind of a minimum viable tool set, and how I should go about best considering the tools that I need, you know. And so that idea of looking at like the situation, motivation, and expected outcome. What am I trying to accomplish with the tools? What am I motivated to do with the tools? And what are the sort of situations that I actually, you know, need to consider to try and kind of help figure out, you know, getting that right match between the tool offering versus what I need. Because a lot of the things that I've also noticed is within the tool space is that hybridization. You've got, for example, Dovetail offering transcription services, but Dovetail's also offering, you know, qualitative tagging. Optimal Workshops is going from, you know, card sorting now to Optimal Workshops now offering qualitative tagging. You know, and so as a result, looking at, you know, because there's so many different kind of mixing and matching of tool options, you know, trying to go with the core things that I need. And so that way I wind up getting that minimum level of tools that, you know, occasionally I can add on as I see fit. And so, you know, going back to those, you know, consideration points, you know, what are those minimal research requirements? I also like to think of it things like, you know, when I'm looking at a tool like the time horizon, you know, in my case, like currently I'm in a new role, it's an established department. I'm not looking for anything more than a year because I want to see how the tools that I'm using will actually work, you know, in the field being used in multiple times in considerations, rather than being locked into like a 2-year contract, realizing really quickly that the tool is just not appropriate for the environment that it's placed. You know, as I said before, looking at that purpose. Other considerations I have is, you know, who's using the tool alongside myself? Is it, you know, other researchers? Is it other designers? You know, how is it, you know, is it easy that I can have one license that, you know, multiple people can share with? Is it something that, you know, only one person can be logged in at a time? I have a funny story about this, but, you know, one of my companies, we had a SurveyMonkey license and they had 2-factor authentication and only one person could be logged in at the same time. And we had to like keep an official record of who was in, you know, working on their surveys at a time, because there was multiple times when we get like the frustrated text being like, I was in the middle of something, who came in, who's messed up my survey, I've been locked out, I need to do this. And, you know, this is one of those things where, you know, we quickly realized we needed multiple licenses because license sharing across 5 researchers just did not work. The other component is cost. You know, having to go through the vendor assessment process recently, like figuring out the cost structure takes time. They've become increasingly less transparent, especially as a lot of, like, for example, recruitment platforms have moved on to a credit-based system. And so you're trying to figure out, based on credits, how much you're actually getting, and having to do a degree of conversions in order to actually be able to compare your costs easily. I think other factors, you know, are you thinking about timelines for approvals, you know, security and risk requirements, and then also thinking about the size of your organization. You know, some tools work really, really well in large scale organizations, like, for example, user testing. I remember on my first job, the first thing I looked at was user testing, and someone was like, if you come to me with a $30,000 line item, it will be an immediate no. You know, you're not going to be able to get such a large expense right away. You know, and so although user testing might have been a really good for our needs, it's just our organization size just didn't support that tool, and vice versa. Sometimes you have really small tools that, you know, work at a one-off situation, but don't really work at a scaled pace. Another component I look at is vendor considerations. So I'm actually really, really geeky about vendors because I had a B2B company. And so my experience with Y Combinator really taught me around some of the most effective ways of actually securing clients through B2B sales. And so as a result of that, when I actually am on the other side, when I'm working with vendors, I really, really try and look at sizing up their business to determine whether or not it's actually suitable for actually the needs of my actual research department. Key thing I always look at is, first I look at actually, Capterra or G2. They're really effective sites for customer and client reviews. And so you can see how people feel about not only, are they delivering a service that they felt that they're getting value from? You're also looking at their business practices. For example, if a company, has a credit balance, are they refunding it? If you purchase more credits than they need, are they actually honoring their agreements and saying that we're actually going to give you your money back for unspent credits? Or are they in a situation where it's like, no, whatever you spend, if you don't use them for the next year, you lose them? These are things that are really effective because it makes sure, say you want to go with that company, in advance, how should I strategize so I don't lose a ton of credits next year, I don't overbuy. Or if they have really bad customer support policies, or if they're very delayed in terms of engaging with you if you have a problem, this is a really good place to see what sort of service they're providing in terms of quality of products, but also quality of customer experience. I also go on Crunchbase. I look at their funding structure, so I want to see what their cash flow is, and to try and understand kind of the trade-offs that I'm making. So, for example, if I've got a company, like there's a really good company for, a research repository, and, I look at them and then I find out they're pre-seed, I don't think I would want to do giant user research repo on a pre-seed company because they don't have established revenue. They don't have a lot of money to sit on. And, if they decide, hey, you know what, we're not going to go with this anymore, we've decided we've moved on, you're in actually, you spent a huge amount of money and time building a research repository that you're going to have to get out of their actual systems because they're not going to do this anymore, or they shut down, or they go bankrupt. And so I always look at that in terms of, if I'm going to have a tool for 4 or 5 years, or it's like I'm looking to grow and build a relationship with, for example, a repo, I want the company to be around for a long time. I also look at it in terms of there is trade-offs. The positive side of it, though, is if you're working with early stage companies, they're much more likely to give you a really favorable deal because they're looking to get, logos on their website because they know that they'll be able to get other customers by securing, for example, your company. So there are also trade-offs. You can get cheaper products, you can get better deals, you can get more preferred rates, but it's also more unstable. The other thing I also do sometimes, and that's actually something I'm doing more and more recently, is looking on LinkedIn to see if they've engaged in layoffs. I had a case with this recently with a vendor where I actually made a sales appointment with one of their reps and then found out that my rep got laid off. And I had to follow up multiple times in order to actually get my demo rescheduled because the person that was overseeing my account as a rep was no longer there. So kind of from that, the key thing, just to wrap up, is really around getting the right tools. There's multiple different strategies that you can to get the right tools at the right rate. And from that, you can it allows you to kind of go into the next step, which is kind of when I look at, the next kind of major area is around research repositories. So for the uninitiated, a user research repo is a database that kind of collects and organizes data, insights, which basically assists research teams and sometimes even the overall organization to collaborate and address user feedback. And so this is something that has been around for a long time. It's kind of grown a lot in terms of interest and focus due to the rise of a lot of these tools like Dovetail. But I do see it as kind of an essential point of research operations and being able to get effective insights quickly. They can be an in-house or purchased solution. So in-house, for example, is like SharePoint, people creating internal databases within Confluence, or purchased solutions. So for example, Dovetail, and there's actually a new competitor called Notably. And so, yeah, from user research repositories, I'm going to have another seed question. I'd love to kind of hear people's experiences on the call with repos, and what your experiences have been in terms of the repo types that you have. So I am going to launch that, and I'd love to feel free to respond away. Okay, looks like we have all our responses. So I'm going to, I'm going to end the poll. And then, yeah, going to ask a C question, which is kind of, I see here that you've got actually a few people that have a purpose-built solution, but many people having a general in-house platform. I guess to start off, folks that have a general in-house platform, what sort of in-house platforms have you been using for your user research repository?
I guess people are feeling a little shy tonight. The one thing that comes to mind as I listen to and just look at this list and listen to the questions is that depending on the size of the organization, it's really going to be quite a mix of things, right? So it's very hard to answer the question, especially in more complex environments. So you're going to get a mix of general purpose, purpose-built, maybe the team is in transition trying to move from, kind of a distributed and heterogeneous sort of mix into a single kind of solution. Bloomfire is what our team is pursuing, or what one of the teams that I work with is pursuing.
Yeah, I have some experience with Bloomfire. I found it's been really, really effective in terms of digesting a lot of really good information and being able to retrieve it quite quickly.
Yeah, I don't know where they're at. I've been away from the team for a while. I don't know where they're at with it, but that was the decision that they made. And I think they've tried to limit the sort of nature of contributors to minimize the complexity initially, because they're, as an insights repository, there's so much potential if you make it across the organization, but it increases the complexity when you have all those different stakeholders you're trying to manage and contribute to.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think goes into, I'll jump into kind of my next point, which is around really that the art, I would say the art of constructing research repositories. I look at actually a lot of the steps of building research repos, and that is, through purpose-built internally or looking at an external tool, as very similar to building digital products. I look at that stages of, brainstorming what the needs are, who the audience is, and really trying to kind of define the right kind of solutions to effectively address those groups and the problems that people are looking to have. And really looking at designing a solution, either it's an internal design exercise or it's being done externally, but also you still have to get people engaged, the testing component of it, is it actually working based on people's needs? I actually do this as more of a usability test, where I've actually taken time to actually usability test the experience with people outside of, for example, my department that I want access to my repo to see if they're actually being able to effectively retrieve the information that they're looking for. And then also looking at that launch phase, getting it launched and then iterating on the actual product in order to ensure that it's being used. I've seen many times where I've seen a very, very great research repository launched. Actually, we had one with one of the companies, we launched it in Dovetail, and I saw that you can send invitations out to people and you can actually see if the status of if they've actually ever signed in or not. It's something that's kind of publicly shown if an invitation is sent versus like an actual account is activated. And what I saw was, for example, none of the product managers ever, accepted their invitation and actually activated an account within Dovetail. And the goal with this actual platform was to get people, across functionally engaged within research to be able to actually collect their research insights easily. And, in that specific case, it failed. And so, one of the things I look at now is, from that experience is how do we actually make sure that the intended audience that you're building a research repo for is effectively engaging in it, and when do you need to redesign it to kind of bring that engagement rate up, just like you would in any product that you're offering. So, after constructing that repo, I also look at kind of the data considerations. What is the data being stored? Presentations, videos, recordings, how access will be monitored. One of the things in my startup, it was great when it was very small group of people and they had access to the same password. That worked really well, except when you start getting sensitive data, your organization grows, suddenly, you need to actually care, a great deal about how access is being monitored, because it's not being shared across 2 people that you work with really closely. There's now 15 people that have access to this information. So looking at, how to effectively monitor access, who has a password, how is that system being shared, looking at the security policies, for example, based on if you're collecting information and there's some kind of legal requirements as to where the information is stored. For example, when I worked with collecting participant information with kids, where is that, if the repo is outside of the country, what sort of legal considerations do you have to have with that? And then also looking at, intended audience. The current repository that I've built is built for my entire organization. It's designed to be easily available. And it's designed to be as transparent as possible, because it's about, trying to build people's relationship with user research. Obviously, in different organizations, with different requirements, you're going to have different needs. And I think that that's the other thing of just looking at how to actually structure that experience and how to monitor it to make sure that it continues to be effective. The other aspect is obviously legal considerations. So what are the legal implications of storing that repo data? For example, if it, is there specific corporate policies that exist? I know within banking there is, and we have to be mindful of those when we store data, and we make sure that, the repo is being reflected accordingly. How long the data should be kept for. I've also had situations where, I've done research projects. I did work with one client, we have to be very careful about putting information in the repo, making sure it's easily available, because the moment, the research project was done, because we were actually working with people who were facing domestic violence, that information needed to be destroyed. Any kind of participant information, the insights could stay, but the information had to be destroyed, and making sure that it was, the repo was designed in such a way that it was easy to actually immediately retrieve that information, and that wasn't being, placed in multiple areas. Other considerations around how the research information is kind of placed in terms of the NDAs, how they're handled. It's one of those situations where it's not really needed until it's needed, and making sure that it's effectively there. Again, when I worked with kids, you always wanted to have that just in case you had a situation with a parent that came back to you and you were able to, provide the information showing that, NDAs and proper consent forms were filled out. So in terms of organizational considerations, looking at your intended audience, sustainable kind of training processes, and really around thinking about the material in terms of relevance and longevity. You know, how do you actually structure your repo within an organization that is able to really be a valuable, deliver continuous value, not just when you make it, but, 5 years later. The big thing is, it's looking at, for example, making sure the data is up to date, or that it's, reflecting information that's most useful after the survey, or any sort of research, when you do it at the time, certain pieces of information is really irrelevant, or 2 years later, it's not. I also look at, for example, like the unhappy past. I had a situation with one of my organizations where we decided we wanted to kind of cut back on, doing research ops. We had a repo, but we wanted to really cut costs. And, finding out, for example, we use Dovetail. It's really, really, really hard to export data off of Dovetail. And we actually wound up suspending our subscription while we were trying to figure things out, not realizing that Dovetail was going to instantly delete the information that we had in our repo. We were paying for data storage, and then suddenly Dovetail decided that they didn't want us to pay for data storage and just deleted all our information. And so, that's one of the big things that I've thought about within the organization, being like, things change and adapt, and being flexible. Additional considerations, training. Training takes time. So, who needs to be trained in terms of the information, getting access to the repo and being able to, effectively take data out. The other piece is also around that longevity piece. How's your repo going to look like with 1 year's, data versus 5? Is it still going to be retrievable? People come and people go, and along with their institutional knowledge. Does the repo, is it structured in a way that kind of makes sense for multiple people, so it can be, grown and developed regardless of who's actually overseeing it? And then going into that whole current company size, is the information structured in a way that's going to be digestible when you have, a team that's 2 times or 3 times larger, that's, filling it with, significantly more data than before. So on my final topic, I'm actually going to talk about democratizing research. So, I really, really like this. Lucy Denton, is actually in Dovetail, talked about, that definition of democratization is really murky. And so at a very high level, you're talking about engaging stakeholders through the research process, but and it could be done through observation, collaboration, or training, but it can really, really depend. And this is something that, is a really hot topic. And there is a lot of controversy, around democratization. I have kind of 2 stories of, come to mind that, one where it's really worked and one where it really hasn't. So, for example, when I was actually at my last startup, I got the whole team to, participate in user research because we were a really small team. And I wanted to ensure that everyone really, really was able to connect with the product and have, a clear idea of what we're trying to accomplish. And it worked fantastically. We really all aligned on what the user needs were and what sort of product we're trying to develop. I've also had times when I've done democratization where, it hasn't worked. I had, one company where, I was, trying to split up, my time. We had a large amount of participants we needed to do. We had a tight timeline. We were like, let's try and kind of integrate it as a team. Worked with a designer who's like, yeah, I'm really excited. really want to participate in the research. And, I did a session, they did a session. And then, I did another session, and they came back and they were still with the same participant. And it was like, they've been talking for 2 hours, what just happened? It was like, oh, I didn't really like the responses. So I wanted to walk through everything with them again, because I just didn't like what they were saying. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, no, this is, this is not what this is a bit problematic. You don't want to keep someone for double the amount of time, and so looking at it as, an example of, this is something, a researcher, from my experience, generally is less likely to do. So, going back into the kind of democratization point, There's definitely some pros thinking of it, increased, I mentioned that earlier around increased capacity for research. You have a huge amount of research that you're trying to do in a very, very limited time. Being able to open it up and having more people engage with the research can really help. It also equips more people in the organization to do research, which, can uncover kind of, that spread of research and in terms of what you can do, or, really innovative connections that you might not be able to see as people are more and more engaged with the research process, for example, from CX or analytics. The work-life balance for researchers, in my case, empowering my team to be able to do research in my absence meant, I could go on vacations and, not have to deal with the fact that all of my projects lined up kind of distributed before or after my vacation, because simply no one else could do it. And then also around that cross-functional collaboration with different people comes different lenses that they can interpret the information and apply to. There is definitely some cons though, talking about diluting the craft of research. You've got people who aren't trained on it. That does increase the possibility of misinformation, and also the issues with quality control. And I mentioned earlier, and having people having supervision as well as tooling costs. If you have a lot more people doing research, it can really, increase the cost of tools, which can, again, restrict the amount of tools that you have access to. So before I kind of jump into kind of the considerations side of things, I do have one last poll, which is really around people's thoughts on the democratization of research. So let me launch that out. Excellent. Okay. I think we got everyone. I'm going to end the poll and share results. So, I mean, it seems like we're all in agreement around the values of democratization. Kind of curious if anyone has any opinions they want to share in terms of the reasons why they're supportive of it.
Yeah, I'm not supportive, but I couldn't vote as a meeting host. I'll tell you why later.
Okay.
Now I'm really curious, Paul. What, like, I would say supportive at Stonier, only because I don't necessarily. I know your example, Geordie, was where a designer, for example, was doing the research, right, and therefore may not have been trained or had all the abilities to do it in a way that a trained researcher might be able to do. But I look at democratizing the research as maybe in pieces, right? So making the data available and the tools for someone outside of a researcher to be able to go in and look at it and slice and dice it in different ways. That's kind of like that first level, and therefore I would expect that everyone, my opinion is anyone should be able to go in and do that, designer, product managers, et cetera, et cetera. But if it comes to democratizing as in doing the research, that's where I'd be a little more hesitant and say, well, I don't think just anybody can go in and interview users, et cetera. I think that specialized training is required for that.
I had trouble answering that question because I wanted to start with it depends. I've been in many different organizations, and some of the pros and some of the cons, like I often see research as criticizing somebody's baby. Somebody's worked really hard, you found some of the issues with it and you want to iterate and improve the baby. But not everybody takes it that way. They take it as, what, is something wrong with my baby? What's wrong with you? And then it becomes sort of a very defensive situation. And so democratization, I've seen sometimes as sort of a way to exclude people, and the desire to keep some of those baby secrets, contained in a very limited space. And so I can totally, we can have a very long discussion about this based on lots of different projects that I have been involved in and different companies where I've seen different versions of this play out and some negative output. So yeah, the idea and the definition so broad as you demonstrated in the previous slide. So like, what do you mean by democratizing? Which part of it are we voting for? Yes, it's a great idea to have people buy into research and be exposed to it. And do we want everyone to do it badly? You know, does that help? And so that's why I had trouble answering your question.
Yeah, and Luna, I really appreciate the nuance there, in really talking with the different elements, and that going back to earlier, that idea of the murkiness of it, and I think as active members of the research communities, this is something that we're going to be considering from some time, which leads to a good opportunity to kind of segue into the kind of last kind of areas of democratization, which is around the considerations for researchers, and that looking at the state of research projects, required, and the maturity level. Is this something that is a very small activity that, is kind of low risk to have people engage in, have someone be able to actually conduct the research themselves? I look at perfect example of this is, in the organizations I've worked with, having UX designers do some of the evaluative research on their designs, because they have, a lot of several established testable hypotheses or assumptions that, seems well within their domain to be able to effectively answer. And the other piece is, around how many researchers are on the team. A large team of researchers, it could be democratization works really, really well with sharing insights and looking at trying to get that information more retrievable, which allows them to focus on actually collecting and gathering insights, versus a small team where, having, other people that are equipped to doing research is a critical means of making sure that, if the researcher decides to quit, and this happened in my first job, when the person that was responsible for doing research quit, no one was able to be, no one was trained in doing it. And so therefore they didn't do user research for 5 months. Looking at the risks of the research projects, in case, the researcher is incapacitated, and also looking at kind of like scaling the researcher, the organization for researchers in the future. How do you actually have that balance of having democratization, while also dealing with, if you're hiring and bringing a lot of people on, where you need to focus on, internally supporting research teams. I look at the non-research considerations as, if they have experience with user research before, the willingness of non-researchers to be trained in actually conducting research, and looking at those specific activities, looking at the tools they're using. For example, working with designers developing maze prototypes works pretty well because they're very knowledgeable about Figma, and it's not a very heavy lift on their work stream. And so, looking at the aspects of, what are effective things to train people on. For example, qualitative tagging might be a little bit beyond a lot of people who aren't actually, trained researchers, versus, putting together, effective, prototypes for usability testing. And then looking at what activities, need supervision, for example, conducting interviews, versus what activities can be done independently, like building a survey. And then also, consideration around tools licensing. I've seen a lot of B2B tools where they're actually restricting how many people can be logged into a session at a specific time, which obviously is led to a lot of challenges. So in summary, after kind of going through these considerations, I do want to kind of touch base on some takeaways before we wrap up, because I'm mindful of the time. Ultimately, ResearchOps is responsible for, orchestrating and optimizing people, processes, and craft in order to amplify the impact and value of user research. Over the past several years, we've seen the type and number of tools grow considerably, and is something I expect to continue to grow. When you look at, due to the large number of tools, consider the job to be done of your research tools and the financial sustainability of vendors to get the tools that you need for what you need to accomplish. And then ultimately view building user research repos as building and maintaining a product. And, you know, as we mentioned earlier, although there is no set model for research democratization, there are both opportunities and challenges depending on how your organization is structured. So with that, I'm actually going to open it up for questions.